Okay, then welcome to the panel on ethics in security and privacy research. My name is Thorsten Holz. I'm one of the PC co-chairs of this year's IEEE Symposium on Security and Privacy. And here we also have Joseph. Welcome. And we organized this panel on rather short notice. Before I introduce the background story why we organized this panel, I first want to introduce the 4 different panelists we have for this 45 minutes. And I propose we basically go down the list how I see them here on my screen. So the first person is Roger Dingledine from the Tor project. So can you maybe just introduce yourself in 1 or 2 minutes?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Roger Dingledine from Tor, and back in the day there were not as many Tor people, and now Tor is a huge ecosystem of lots of different projects. So Tor is a project to try to help people on the internet be safer, more private, more secure. There are a lot of different pieces to that. But the reason why we're here today talking about ethics and safety is the Tor Research Safety Board, which I'd be happy to chat about a little bit more in a bit. But the basic idea for the safety board is we're trying to encourage more and more papers to have a safety section in the paper on why the research that they did about Tor or Tor users or the Tor network was done safely and was worthwhile. So I'll pause on that and continue later on.
Thank you, Roger. Then next is Erin Connelly from Guidewire and Alchemy. Maybe you can also briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. Morning and good evening, afternoon, everyone. Yeah, Erin Connelly. I'm the director of cyber risk strategy at Guidewire Science, currently formerly with DHS. And I think more pertinent to this conversation, I was the project lead for the Menlo report, one of the lead authors there as well. So my opinions will be largely informed by a lot of the work that was done there, and I was very gratified to see Menlo mentioned in the course of some of the reviews for this study.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the influential reports that should guide the work we do in academic security and privacy research. Then we have Katie Shelton from the University of Maryland, College Park.
Hi, I'm Katie Shelton. I'm an associate professor in the information school at the University of Maryland in College Park. And my research and interest and focus is information and data ethics. But as part of that, I've gotten really interested in research ethics in big data environments and in internet environments. And as part of that work, I've been the chair for the last 2 years of the Research Ethics Committee for SIG-CHI, which is in the ACM. It's an interest group focused on HCI, and we see a lot of paper issues and try and give advice on norms and best practices, and we've been really influenced by things like the Menlo report, and so I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that or about my research in this space, and really excited to be here today.
Thank you, Katie. And then the last person on our panel today is Joseph Bono from New York University. Welcome, Joseph.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, so I maybe spend most of my time researching applied crypto and cryptocurrencies now, but I spent a large part of my career working on passwords and authentication, which was a good experience. It bumped me up into a couple of pretty interesting ethical dilemmas that I think the community still doesn't agree on, how to balance scientific value and respect for persons that maybe I could talk to later. So I have sort of gone the gamut from doing crypto research to human subjects research, publishing at Chi and Soups and getting to know those communities a little bit. And it's been a really interesting experience, I guess, seeing how ethical concerns are differently at different places and how they're have become continually something that the security and privacy research community is grappling with.
Okay, thank you. And as I said, these are the 4 panelists. I will serve as the moderator for the next about 40 minutes. And in case you have questions, there's the Q&A tab that you should see within Hopin. So feel free to also ask questions. And we have prepared a few questions for this discussion. But in case you have something that you would like to comment on, or that the panelists should comment on, please use the chat and we'll keep an eye on whatever kind of question comes up. As I said earlier, this panel was organized on a rather short notice, and probably most of you know a bit about the background. So the starting point for all of the discussions we had was the Hippocrate commits paper that was accepted and later withdrawn by the authors. It generated quite a lot of discussion, actually within the program committee, both related to ethical concerns and then also technical aspects. So the PC also spent quite a lot of time to investigate the technical contributions of this work. And there was a long discussion thread on the message board with more than 180 comments in the message platform we use related to this one single paper. We had about 40 PC members who participated in this discussion. So this also generated a lot of interest among the PC. So about a third of all PC members sent at least one message. And we actually initially planned to have a voting what to do with the paper, but then the authors decided to withdraw the paper from the conference. There was also lots of discussion on social media and Twitter related to the paper, and it was also picked up by the press, especially given that there was a long discussion between the involved researchers and the Linux kernel developers. And at the end, there was several statements by the Linux kernel developments how the paper should be treated or how the university should continue to perform work in this space. And then one of the action items was to withdraw the paper, and there were several other steps involved, and the Linux developers also analyzed all the kernel commits submitted by the university. They found several buggy patches, but none of them were really related to the Hippocrate commit paper. But then at the end, as I said, the paper was withdrawn. And we used this as a starting point to reflect in more general terms how ethics in security and privacy research should be considered. We heard about the Menlo report already. It was published almost 10 years ago. It was somewhat a reaction to a lot of work that was done in the botnet space, and lots of controversial studies were performed back then, where also code on machines not under the control of the researchers was executed. Lots of private information was collected, and then the Menlo report sets new standards. I think now we are at another turning point where also many other communities are discussing ethical aspects of research. For example, CVPR, so a conference in the image domain, they have an ethics panel next month. IMC has revised the ethics discussion within the paper. So in the network measurement area, there are ongoing discussions. We heard that Sakai has started to introduce an ethics review process. And so therefore we think that also in security and privacy, this kind of discussions need to happen. As one of the reactions for this Hippocrate commits paper, we took some actions. For example, in the review form for IEEE Security and Privacy 2022, we now have a checkbox where authors can where the reviewers can raise ethical concerns. So they can click this checkbox, and then they should comment in the review what kind of ethical concern they have with the paper. And we are also about to establish an ethics review board, where we will develop procedures how an ethical review process should be implemented. ICLR, so one of the flagship conferences in machine learning, has also introduced an ERB review process. And so we see lots of things happening. And within this panel, we want to reflect on what kind of steps we think are or should be followed. We heard about the Tor safety board, which is a great idea. We heard about Sakai already. We heard about the Menlo report. So let's start with the discussion. Probably everyone here also on the panel heard about the Hippocrates Commits paper. So what are your thoughts about this? So how do you see the situation in just not being one of the reviewers, but just from the outside? What do you think went wrong? How was the situation handled? And what are your thoughts on this specific paper? Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in here and kick us off. So, I'll frame my thoughts kind of in the same way that I frame, I think about and frame the ICT research ethics state of affair, which is to say, I think of it as a three-legged stool, right? So you've got principles, ethical principles, you've got the applications of those principles, and then you've got the implementation of those principles. So if you look back with regards to where we are and where we were when Menlo was stood up, from a principle standpoint, we've got things like the Belmont Report. We had Menlo come along. We've got these professional organizational codes. I think where there's still a gap is this shared frame of reference. I think we've made a lot of progress there, and I'm not suggesting that there should be one code of conduct to rule them all, but I do think that there are gaps in between these different principles. With regards to applications, we've got things like, we stood up the Menlo Companion Report. We've got, we also developed something called an ethical impact assessment, which led to a CREDS tool, which was essentially a decision support tool. Didn't gain a lot of traction, but the point is, it was kind of a self-regulatory tool for researchers to use. Where we still have gaps, I think, in the application space is ethics and management guidance. And then I think from an implementation standpoint, we've got the IRBs, ERBs, we've got PCs, we've got funding organizations. We still have a gap with regards to incentive and enforcement. So I think more specifically to this study, kind of using that as a framework, looking at the principles leg of the stool, I would say that there was a misconception and a misinterpretation of this notion of human subjects research. For one, the researchers took it upon themselves to determine that this was not human subject research and shouldn't have, and they did not run it by the IRB. I think that's a big no-no. It's not their call. Any researcher who is federally funded is obligated under the common rule to have their research to seek an opinion from the IRB. Even setting that aside, I think the researcher's position that under kind of a self-regulatory note, and I think their position that this was not human subjects was faulty. They claimed that this was purely a technical patching process that they were studying, that they were not studying individual behaviors. But I mean, look, the fact of the matter is that humans, the maintainers, were integral to the process. So to try and kind of decouple and dehumanize the research by kind of deflecting to this abstract process, I just think is patently incorrect. They were effectively, testing to see whether those code maintainers can detect buggy code is the bottom line. I think the IRB misinterpreted the exemption. Eventually they got the researchers got an IRB review as per the S&P request. And I would say, I believe my understanding is that they used 45 CFR, I think it was D2. And I think that was misapplied. Essentially that says that if a research that includes interactions involving observation of public behavior, researchers can't readily identify the human subjects, or there's no risk of damaging kind of the reputation of those human subjects, it's exempt. I think that this study kind of fails both legs. I would also add that from the principal standpoint of human subjects, Menlo recommends this notion of human harming potential. So it doesn't just start with this notion of, is there a human subject involved, but it's an evolved standard, and it suggests that it should be not whether there's just human subjects, but whether human subjects, there's a potential to be harmed. If you move to another principle, which is beneficence, and that's kind of a risk-benefit calculation, frankly, and it's this notion of maximizing the benefit for the community and minimizing the harm to individual human subjects. I would question whether the researchers were creating new generalizable knowledge with regards to benefit to the community. They had already claimed that the hypocrite commits were possible and had already occurred in numerous occasions. So the question is whether this bug introducing patches were fundamentally different enough to justify the risk, I think is an open question. Yeah. With regards to minimizing the risk to human subjects, they didn't follow any type of deception protocol. Now, they were not bound by the IRB protocol, which normally, if you're engaging in deception research, you have to kind of debrief the human subjects afterward. This was not done. The researchers, to their credit, they claimed that all three of the BIPs were stayed in the email exchanges. They didn't become Git commits. That's great. I don't know that that's fail-safe. The question is, could other community members have incorporated those patches into non-mainline versions of the code? I also think I would add here, again, harkening back to Menlo, we implemented this notion of stakeholder analysis as part of this respect for persons construct. And so looking at the whole spectrum of humans involved, so the primary people that are being studied, the secondary folks, so kind of the intermediaries of the systems that are responsible for the confidentiality and the integrity and the availability of systems and data, and then other key stakeholders. So the researchers themselves, the criminals they're studying, things like that. I think they would have identified that, not only the kernel development community as being a stakeholder, the end users who were part of that email thread, and I think the maintainers themselves in terms of wasting their resources and their time with this study. And then finally, with regards to beneficence, you have to ask the question is, could they have conducted the study using less risky alternatives? I would argue yes. If you look at all of their suggestions for improving the patching process, which was sort of the outcome of this research, all of these could have been made entirely without undertaking this research, right? So they had recommended updating the code of conduct, using automated tools to test and verify patches, increasing the open source maintainer staffing, and raising awareness of potential buggy patches. I think those all could have been done without undertaking the specific methodology that they undertook. I would also say that Menlo recommends this additional principle of respect for law and public interest. And this really requires, kind of transparency and accountability to laws and policies and codes of conduct. I don't know that the Linux kernel development had a code of conduct when this research was committed. I'm certain that they do now. But the question is, should the researchers been aware of code of conduct to follow there? Just real quickly then, those are the principles. With regards to the application of the principles, I do think that there's still a gap with regards to ethics management guidance. And this was a good example of that. The researchers didn't really have much guidance outside of the IRB, and the IRB, I don't know, I think was a little bit deficient here. Moving to the last leg of the stool, the enforcement of the principles. Again, I think the IRB whiffed on this one. I think the PC didn't provide the checks and balances initially. Now I think the PC did a really good job of self-correcting after it was brought to their attention. Where I think the big win goes to the community and the peers that checked and balanced this work and raised the issue to S&P, to the researchers, and I think they were a critical forcing function. So that was a big win in my mind. I think the S&P changes that you mentioned, Thorsten, are very good. I think I give a thumbs up to all of those, and those I think will definitely advance the ball.
Okay, thank you for this very long list, and actually it reflects also many of the points we discussed in the PC. Basically, I think Joseph, he was also the one who brought up that there are many alternatives for this kind of studies, and so yeah, I think you nicely summarized many aspects we had with the internal PC discussions. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess to reinforce that, to me, like it was an interesting case where, the fact that the research methodology was involved interacting with real developers with real risk actually introduced problems to the scientific validity of the work. In particular, the work's really hard to replicate, right? Because we don't want to have tons and tons of studies burdening the same open source developers to check. The sample size was really small for the same reason. There were only 3 hypocrite commits, so it's very difficult to generalize from 3 data points. And the other issue, which the PC spent a lot of time discussing and getting to the bottom of, because it was quite confusing, is the fact that the hypocrite commits in the paper weren't actually, they were sort of rejected by the reviewers for reasons that didn't have to do with the bugs that were being introduced. So it was, I guess, unclear if those would have been ultimately committed if the superficial problems had been fixed by the submitters. They pulled them back at that point, which was always their plan, to not allow them to be merged. But there's kind of this impossible situation with this research design that you can't say for sure that the community would have accepted the patches until they were accepted. They could have been killed really at any point in the process until final merging. But since for ethical reasons, you didn't want to allow them to finally merge, you had to pull back at some point, and you can always sort of say, well, they might have been killed after the point that we tried to put the brakes on. So it was kind of impossible to say with this methodology if they ever would have been merged, if they'd been fixed up anyway. That's all on the point of beneficence. If this was the best way to gain scientific understanding for the possible harms. That was what was most troubling to me about it.
I've certainly noticed this pattern in interesting computer security papers over the years where the reviewers are like, oh my gosh, that's so cool, that's amazing, they actually did it. But I mean, years ago I was reviewing like a Skype paper where the highlight of the Skype paper was that they found an exploit and broke into 700,000 Skype users and learned where they were and who they were calling and what they were doing. And like the second half of the paper was like, for example, here's, Allison in Albuquerque and what she does with Skype. And we ended up rejecting that paper. Good, but there were several reviewers who were like, "No, this is really important. Look, they showed that it worked." So the question that I ask myself in those situations is, if we took away the outrageous, probably criminal, certainly unethical side of this paper, what would be left? Would we be left with good science that shows us something, or is the outrageous part the reason why the reviewers are excited to take it?
Yeah, that's actually a good point that you raise, because as also mentioned in the PC statement that you can also find on the conference website, this paper received 2 accepts and 2 accepts by the reviewers. So it was rated among the top 5% of submissions at the conference. So from a technical point of view, it apparently contains many interesting insights. And in practice, we see that this type of supply chain attacks, where the attackers do not directly attack a company, but indirectly, they happen in practice a lot. And one interesting data point to support this is that the Linux developer, they reviewed about 400 patches, also submitted by UMN, and found that about 22% of them contain bugs. So it's not that bugs happen just intentionally, but sometimes also unintentionally. And 20% is something that I hadn't expected. So they raised a real world problem in the paper. And then, yeah, this also led to many interesting discussions we had in the PC. Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's an age-old complaint in the security research community that there's a bias towards attack papers because, you can show that an attack works, and any sort of defensive system is much harder to know if it's going to work. And to me, sometimes the extreme end of that bias is not only demonstrating an attack in some sort of controlled way, but doing it in the wild or on a real system somehow gets you the most credit for actually doing something. And I think even separate from ethical issues, it seems like everybody agrees it would be nice if we could have less of a bias towards attack papers. But yet somehow it seems to have persisted for my whole career publishing in security anyway.
And that framing, Joe, I think brings up something that that this case illustrates really nicely, which is that not always, but often attack papers are going to involve a socio-technical network, not just a technical network, right? There are humans generally somewhere in there, not entirely, right? But that, for researchers in that space who are attracted to that kind of work and that kind of paper, I think the cueing that there are probably humans in this network, right? I need to be thinking about human subjects research. We just need to make that more automatic in labs. And I think discussions like this, high profile discussions in communities, actually have a really positive effect on that kind of cueing for researchers to see the socio in the socio-technical and to think through, well, I probably do need to talk to a review board or an IRB, although just to point out, not every researchers from every country don't have access to IRBs, and IRBs are not always great at spotting this issue. So this is not a one-off, right? This IRB not seeing the humans in the technical is fairly common in IRBs across the U.S. There are IRBs that are getting better at this, but it's challenging for them. They traditionally haven't reviewed a lot of computer science research, and that's changing. It's changing quite a bit. But until that changes, labs and lab leaders need to be the people who are sensitive to this, and then review committees need to be sensitive to this too, that IRBs might miss it, that there might be harms beyond human subjects. I mean, I really like the turn in Menlo from human subject research to human harming research, because I think it is a different standard, and one that, for attack papers is worth thinking through every single time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead, Tristan.
What I just want to mention is that this also was something we discussed extensively, that IRB is more like a US, or at US university it's required. Many European or Asian universities do not have a formal IRB review process, especially not in computer science, and also industry labs typically do not have IRB procedures. So how do you make sure that also these parties follow the ethical guidelines? So a code of conduct was mentioned before, but that's also something we can discuss later. So Roger. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that IRB breakdown is part of what led to the TOR Research Safety Board, because a lot of people don't have an IRB, and even if they go to the IRB, they say, "Are you drawing blood?" No, then why are you even talking to me? What does this have to do with an IRB? So the goal in the TOR Safety Board is to get the authors to write about the safety in their paper, and to get the reviewers to expect a section in the paper about safety. And
can you,
we need both of those pieces. Yeah.
Probably not everyone is familiar with the TOR Safety Board. Can you maybe briefly summarize what you're doing, because then everyone knows what's happening? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the goal that I just described was exactly that. We want the authors to write about safety. We want the reviewers to expect some writing about it. Basically, we've got some guidelines, things like use a test TOR network if you can, don't collect data that isn't safe to have, minimize and so on. I'll paste a link to it in the chat in a bit. But the basic idea is you should, before you do your research, think through and write down, what are you trying to do? How are you making it safe? What risks remain? And why is that worth it? And the goal of the safety board isn't to be a barrier or a gate. We don't give permission. The idea is that we're a sounding board where you write that down, and then there are some experts who know a lot about TOR who help you think through what you missed, who help you say, well, in this case, you're writing down IP addresses, and you could write down hashes of them, or you're writing down hashes, but there are only 4 billion IP addresses, so hashing the IP address doesn't actually keep it safe. So different from the IRB world, for example, we're really not big on, I'm going to have a scary data set, but don't worry, I'll encrypt it and it'll be fine. We want you to not have dangerous data. We want you to construct your research in a way where there is no point that has potentially harmful data. One of the useful analysis techniques that we found especially useful is, so you're going to collect some sort of data set. Imagine there's somebody out there with some other arbitrary other data set. Is combining your data set with their data set going to help them in any way? And that sort of composition of data sets question has revealed a lot of interesting, oh gosh, I didn't think about this. Yeah, I'll try to change that analysis. So that's the basic idea of the research board, of the safety board. Notice that I said safety, not ethics. I mean, it is an ethics board in the sense that that it's about the trade-offs, it's about the balance, it's about it's worth it. But I go with the word safety because everybody starts arguing about what ethics means, whereas safety is pretty clear. We've handled about 35 cases. We started about 5 years ago. And it's also the case that that not everybody uses the safety board. It's a voluntary thing, but the people who want to do their TOR research safety want to get safely want to get this feedback on whether their methodology or their approach is right. And the way that we win is when program committees say, I'm not sure about your approach. You didn't convince me about the safety side of things. And there are definitely some challenges that we've seen. For example, I've seen review committees say, well, you didn't get permission from the TOR safety board. And I don't care if you have permission from the TOR safety board. I care whether your paper convinces reviewers that you did your stuff safely. So it's about changing the expectations. It's not about creating another barrier. And there's some other challenges, but that's I'll pause there, and that's what the safety board is.
So that's very similar in approach and format to the SIG-CHI Research Ethics Board. SIG-CHI Research Ethics is research ethics, so it's a slightly bigger bucket than safety, but only slightly, right? The research part of research ethics is important, so we don't weigh in on, even research misconduct, like plagiarism, things like that. There's a separate board for that at SIG-CHI, but also sort of, bigger ethical issues of, I'm trying to think of things we don't weigh in on. It's easier for me to say what we do weigh in on, which is, considerations of safety of persons, potential harms, whether or not there are human subjects in the research, and then advice on ways to mitigate potential harms. And so it's a very similar. It's set up a little bit differently. So I really like the idea of the safety board because researchers can go to it before they conduct the research, which seems really important. And that's something the SIG-CHI Research Ethics Board is trying to get out there into the world, that you could talk to us before you start your research. We don't get a ton of those inquiries, although occasionally we do. And we're trying to sort of push it out to the SIG-CHI community that, come talk to us before you start is even better. But what we tend to get are references from reviewers during the review cycle, where reviewers are uncertain about the ethics of a paper, or they want a sort of another set of opinions from folks who have quite a bit of experience in research ethics. And so again, it's very much like the safety board. It's people who have been researching in research ethics or doing research ethics work for a long time who just give feedback. And 80% of the time it's please just write more about this in your paper, right? Write more about your decision making, write more about why you chose to do it that way. Please tell us what you considered, what options you discarded, right? And it just has to be a paragraph. It doesn't have to be a lot, but please tell us about your thinking. That's the majority of the cases we see, because I think this all points to, even the dream is that research ethics is just a part of good methods, right? That reflection on methods and what method you choose and why includes thinking about the ethics of human subjects research. And so, if we make it part of paper processes, then that helps with that sort of norming, right? That this is just a part of good research ethics of scientific integrity. So that's really, where and like the safety board, the SIG-CHI Research Ethics Board doesn't make judgments on papers. We send comments back to the reviewers, and the reviewers decide. We've sort of left it at that. And it's also not a required piece of SIG-CHI papers to have an ethics statement. There's been talk about that. It's pretty controversial. And so instead we've sort of stepped back and said, all right, call us when you want another opinion, we're here. And similarly, we get around the same volume, interestingly. We get 10 papers a year, and we've been around for about 4 years. So it's not a huge volume that we're seeing, right? This isn't a huge number of papers where reviewers don't feel like they have all the expertise to look at the ethical issues in the paper. So, and because that's the other thing, right, is that we're not seeing every paper with ethical issues in it, I'm sure, right? There are plenty where reviewers feel totally competent to to push back on authors, or and so we're really just there as a sort of backstop for controversial cases that are really at the edge of best practice in the field, because there are a lot of undecided. It's hard to know when to use deception in online studies because good debriefing can be difficult to do, right? And so how the questions of how impactful does research need to be before you need to use deception or is a hard one, and we're happy to sort of weigh in on that.
Okay, I would just real quick reinforce a couple of those notions, and I think the importance that has borne out, the importance that the PC and safety boards that Roger mentioned play. If you look at sort of these forcing functions, the main ones being the IRBs and the PCs and funding institutions, and I'm kind of disheartened to see somewhat lack of development on the IRB space about these issues. I don't think there's been much advancement with regards to funding agencies, but I think the PCs have definitely stepped up. I mean, when you think about it, these folks are the gateways to those incentives that are driving researchers, right? So the research and publication, the ability to achieve tenure, delivering on grant funding. And so I think they play an important role, and I see them as really stepping up.
So there's a strategy question here, which is how, if you look at the ethics question at the point where the research has been done and the paper's been written and the paper's been submitted, and it turns out that it was dangerous, then A, it's too late, and B, if each conference has its own opinions about what it should do, and some of them care about safety and ethics and some of them don't, then the authors should just turn their paper around to someplace that'll take it. And so how do we as a field need to unify in some way? Or is it okay enough that like Oakland becomes known for not taking unsafe papers, whereas San Jose starts getting known as they'll take anything? Like, where does this strategy question end?
I mean, I think that the whole forum shopping is definitely a problem. I know back when I was more deeply involved with this, there was this notion of having some sort of cross correlation of the different PCs. So take a member from each organizing or program committee, and so you're going to kind of cross pollinate ideas and values. I think that's one idea to move forward.
I mean, I think this came up as an argument against retracting the paper in the PC, that the research was already done, so publishing it didn't cause any further harm. Although I actually sort of took the opposite.
No.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with you, and I also feel like the harm of retracting a paper in the modern day is fairly low, because authors can self-publish, they can go to ePrint or archive, which it's unrealistic to expect that ePrint or archive are ever going to reject papers for ethical reasons. I mean, they're basically accept anything. Mm-hmm. So I think people will always be able, including this paper, which was withdrawn by the authors, is still, people can find it on the web and read it, and there's no great, scientific loss. I think it's more of just, establishing a community standard that we don't want to recognize work that we consider to have been unethical with publication in what is supposed to be, the most prestigious venue for the field, and really an honor to have your research published.
Yeah, and so I just saw Kurt Thomas also posted a question. So I can probably disclose that Usenix Security is also looking into establishing an ethics review process. So I expect that also the major conferences will follow. We heard about NeurIPS. This was also mentioned in the Q&A, and ICLR, we have SIGCHI, we have IMC. So it seems like many communities are thinking about introducing a process. So I guess this kind of shopping to go to the venue with the least ethical concerns will not happen. So, which is a good thing. And we have about 5 minutes left. So I want to pick a few questions here from the audience and maybe then keep it a bit brief. There was a question by Alvaro, because there was also an ethics feedback panel that was organized around 2016, 2017. And Erin, you were part of this. Can you maybe briefly explain why this ceased to exist?
That's a great question. So I was, I sort of liken it in some ways to what Roger's doing with the safety board. It never got a lot of traction. Frankly, I'm not sure, maybe because we weren't focused enough. We sort of got this group together and said, hey, look, we exist, sort of fly our banner. And if you guys need advisement, come seek our advice. I would say that we reviewed, I would say maybe 5 cases, and then it just sort of eventually, disbanded. It didn't disband because there was any sort of criticism about the work we were doing. I think probably it's because we weren't focused enough. I think perhaps tying the group to, like I mentioned, one of those, kind of forcing functions, incentive mechanisms, whether that be publishing a paper or getting grant funding or whatnot, might have given it more traction. And then from that traction, potentially we could have built more network effects to become, eventually it was envisioned as this group that would sort of really fill that gap that the IRBs were not filling. And it also could have been a timing thing as well. Like, ethics, and to a certain extent now, it's probably still the case where, researchers do everything they can to avoid having to deal with the IRB. But we should, try and position it as rewarding ethical behavior as well.
Yeah, tomorrow evening there's a TC meeting, and as part of the TC meeting, also the question will be brought up whether we can somehow organize such a standing committee for security and privacy research. So if you're interested, please join tomorrow's TC meeting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just going to add that about 10 years ago in the SOUPS community, there was an attempt to establish an independent equivalent of an IRB for researchers from an institution that didn't have one, and I believe it was similar. It ran for a couple of years and sort of lost momentum and died. So hopefully that's not the way of the world, that we all get excited about ethics after a high-profile case like this, and then run out of steam a few years later. I think we all need to think about how we can keep sustainability for the process.
One of the challenges that we have in the safety board side, one of my original visions was to build like a library of public examples of people doing their analysis and our analysis of their analysis, and then the paper that came out of it. But on the other hand, we provide a PC-like confidentiality because, you're trusting us even more because you come to us before you've done the work and before you've written the paper. So we shouldn't, leak what you're doing. And that means that it takes years before the authors are ready to have it go public. So there's work to be done on pulling together all of these little snippets of text and so on from 2 years ago and putting them onto the website in a useful way. So if somebody in the audience is excited to help us publish the Tor Research Safety Board history in a way that's useful to the world, please let me know.
Mm-hmm. Then there was another comment about 20 minutes ago from Anonymous about that some of the selling claims in the paper do not really reflect what actually happened on a technical level in practice. And the PC considered this mismatch between the description and the actual research. And we also comment on this in the PC statement. And this definitely is also an ethical issue. Mm-hmm. Then there was a question by Kurt, also a bit more on the technical side, because in practice, it's not only about human subject research, but also terms of service violations, that you're prohibited to reverse engineer something. Scraping is something that often comes up. So is there some kind of line what such an ethics review committee should consider, or where do you see some kind of guidelines? Or are there
This is why I use the word
safety?
This is why I use the word safety, because it's about users and keeping the users safe. And it does come down to what the priorities of the reviewers are. Is our goal to maintain the safety of the mega corporations, or is our goal to maintain the safety of the users?
But so this question of of terms of service comes up on the SIGHI committee every year because it's really hard. And it's a power question, right? So that's the thing. Like, so there's human subjects research, and there's also considerations of our, as researchers, relationships with large organizations. And some of them are open source, volunteer led, and some of them are Facebook, right? And so what we've been telling researchers is, breaking terms of service is risky. Please don't ask your grad students to do it on your behalf, right? Like, if you're going to take this risk, take it on yourself. But we are not going to tell you what the right judgment of that power relationship is, right? If you think you have to do this in order to understand something that a big corporation won't let you understand in any other way, that's your call. Because there are ethical arguments for sometimes breaking terms of service, but there are also lots of ethical arguments for not breaking terms of service. It depends on what you're doing, and it becomes very hard to weigh in. But we do think, senior researchers should take into consideration that it may be illegal, and asking students to participate in that could be really risky, and sort of thinking through those issues as a sort of an activist risk of your own. But I do think it's different to aim it at Linux, which is a powerful organization, but is also an open source volunteer-led one, than other organizations. So that comes into the equation, right? Like, who are you aiming at?
Okay, great. So 45 minutes are over. So maybe just as a last question, because I think Erin mentioned this in her opening statement, maybe a question for everyone, just a quick answer. Do you think we should work on a code of ethics for Oakland that we publish at the conference website, such that we have some clear guidelines?
I can go first. I think I'd be in favor of a relatively short formal code of ethics that mentions things like following the principles in the Menlo report and having an ethical review board. But possibly a longer, kind of like Roger was mentioning, set of case studies that handle things like terms of service that are specific to our community that are hard. And, there's never going to be, I don't think, a formulaic answer. There's just case studies of what, we've considered to have been appropriate or not appropriate in the past. So I could see separating those two things as something that ideally we would have as a resource.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And
Yeah, I think
Menlo has a great start on that, but updating those Menlo case studies because there have been more in the last 10 years. Yeah, I think that's great. Sorry, Erin.
Yeah, I mean, I think thanks for the plug. I think having that foundational code of conduct doesn't hurt. We don't need yet another code of conduct, I think, to fix the problem, though. I think we need more work on the application and the implementation of those principles. And so maybe things like providing assistive questions, which was part of the Menlo Companion report, might be more helpful for researchers to, undertake the responsibility of ethically defensible research, because that's ultimately, where we want to go. And a lot of those codes of conduct are kind of abstract and not necessarily the most helpful. But I do think some of those other ideas that you all came up with in S&P, are helpful and actionable.
Mm-hmm.
I think the most important thing is to make it clear to the reviewers and to the authors that considering safety or ethics is part of the review process and is part of the science process. So if the question is, should S&P write down what our standards are, this is on that side of the line, this is on that, I don't think that's going to work. But if the question is, should S&P emphasize that this is an important integral piece of doing science correctly, then yes, heck yes.
Okay, thank you. And with this, I would like to conclude the panel. So thanks again for all these panelists and all the Q&As that came up. There are quite a few thoughtful and helpful discussions, also as mentioned in the Q&A window. So thanks a lot for being here, and then enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.